Be strong.
A massive battle is unfolding in the kingdom of Grandis. Hundreds of knights are going on the attack. It takes place on the last line of defense of the Fortress of Endeavor. 3 of the squad are burning red in a fire, everything around them churning and collapsing. They just fall into the abyss. The knights are engaged in a bloody battle. This battle will go down in history. 2 horrible green orcs are trying to climb the wall of the fortress. A squad of knights tries to stop them, but they fail. The leader of the squad of knights shouts furiously for the soldiers to fight hard. He is agitating them to destroy all those orcs. There is fear and hatred in his eyes. The orcs speak an unknown language. They have huge fangs protruding from their mouths, their eyes glowing red. The bloodthirsty monsters are determined. Everything is burning with red flames and explosions are being emitted everywhere. One of the main orcs uses magic. A bright flash of purple light appears in front of his hands. The size of these orcs is gigantic. They are bigger than an ordinary man. In their huge paws, they have the simplest weapons, sharply sharpened axes and knives. The orcs are simply mad. On all their faces read only lust for the death of the enemy. They shout loudly, making noises incomprehensible to the average person. The deputy commander of Fortress Endeavor, Filion Endeavor, looks worried. He is nervous and talks about the orcs falling into a berserk state. Standing behind the grandstand and watching the horror of it all, Filion says it's only a matter of time before the south gate falls. That's where it's headed. Not only that, the orcs are huge in number and have a powerful force. The main trouble comes when the Orc Lord enters the battle. The Orc Lord looks the most intimidating of all. He is different from the previous lords, for he is a master of aura. This Orc Lord can use special aura skills, making him different from all normal orcs. The deputy is watching through binoculars what is happening on the battlefield. The orcs have already taken the castle walls. Behind him are the guards. The orcs have already reached the stairs. They sneak forward and forward, not noticing the squad of knights in their way. Everything around them is ablaze. Invender's squad watches in horror at what is happening. They shout to the other soldiers that no matter what, they need to defend the walls. The orc's huge green paw comes with such unthinkable force that nothing can be done anymore. An orc's leg would simply crush one of Invender's knights beneath it. Orcs fear nothing. They don't even notice anyone under their feet. The surprised orc stands and watches as the soldier he just crushed rises from the dead. The soldier lying on the ground in his blood begins to slowly rise. His body is covered in blue flames. The dead are lying on the rocks. Suddenly, they all start to come to life and stand up. In the hands of one of the knights of Invender's squad, an unusual ball of blue color can be seen. It is sparking. There is a blue shadow around like a mist. The reviving knight is mercilessly crushed by one of the orcs with its huge clawed paws, but he, feeling no pain, is reborn again. The reborn knights take on a different appearance. They have glowing eyes and look like walking corpses. The orcs can't understand how this is even possible. The living soldiers of Invender stand perplexed, with their mouths wide open. The revived knights turn into walking corpses. Their bodies are torn, congealed blood is visible from the wounds, and every muscle is visible. One of the rebel knights is all writhing and squirming. Suddenly, he draws his sword and thrusts it straight into the throat of the terrified orc. The unthinkable is happening. The rebel soldiers have tremendous power. The orcs are amazed at what is happening. The squad begins to slash furiously with their swords at the orcs. One of the orcs shouts that a necromancer has appeared. The Orc Lord appears on the roof of the castle. He spins around, forming large blobs of fire and ash around him. Everything collapses and explodes into pieces. The aura of the Lord collapses everything in its path. A man in a black cloak appears. He forms purple circles around himself, from which lightning bolts of light emerge. This man is a necromancer. He holds a green orb in his hand. As expected of an aura master, he begins to summon his assistants. Scary monsters appear out of the purple haze. One with red hair and an evil face, and the other looks like some kind of beast with huge fangs. So also came to the rescue a creature with a head of which only the skull remained, all its muscles bare. He looks like a corpse. Now it's their turn. The green creatures and the rebel squad unite and go on the attack. The orc's huge aura swings a spiked bat. Compared to him, the squad and the green creatures seem so small and helpless. She swings the bat with all the force he's capable of. The spiked bat hits the ground. The spiked bat hits the ground with such force that all the opponents around it fly in different directions. The Orc Lord is wildly indignant and enraged, his eyes filled with blood, his jaws clenched to a squeak. There is a fight between an Orc Lord and a creature with a skull for a head. The creature attacks the Orc with a lightsaber. The Orc Lord strikes the dead man with his axe. The dead man folds in half and cannot resist him any longer. Then a ravenous beast with a tail comes to his aid. He runs with inhuman speed. The beast grabs the Orc, lifting him off the ground. He tries to resist it, but it fails. At this moment, the dead man is holding a sword and trying to stab the Orc. An ugly smile can be seen on his face. A fight takes place between an Orc Lord and a ravenous beast with a tail. The latter has an advantage over the Orc because of his inhuman speed. The beast with the tail clenched its mouth so that all its sharp teeth and huge fangs were visible. His gaze was filled with hatred, his eyes burning. Suddenly he makes a circle of light with his paw. Those try to take cover, but the blow lands directly on the Orc Lord and he flies away. The Orc Lord squirmed in pain. The blow hit him right in the lower abdomen. The Necromancer fights the Orc angrily. With his sword, he chops off his arm, blood spurting from his mouth. A Necromancer with such swordsmanship skills. A ravenous beast and a Necromancer attack the enemy. They run at an unthinkable speed. A small creature that looks like a fairy appears. It has wings. Compared to the monsters, it is very small in size. No matter what the red-haired monster does, no matter where he is, a small creature with wings is everywhere flying above him, helping him. The monster with red hair swings his two arms fiercely to strike the ground again. His jaw is wide open, revealing all of his teeth. He once again hits the ground with tremendous force so that the opponents fly up and fly away. Everything around him burns and bursts into flames. On the battlefield, lying exhausted, they have no strength to fight any further. A small winged creature watches it all. This winged creature also has its own power. It emits black haze-like streaks from itself, which has the same effect on the opponent. The Orcs are simply shocked at what is happening. Their eyes show confusion, and they don't know how to proceed. The red-haired monster spins around, destroying everything in its path. Almost no one is left alive, all torn to shreds, blood everywhere. Everything is shrouded in black, haze-like streaks. There are red clots of blood everywhere. It's hard to make out what's going on here. The surviving soldiers who have been watching all of this are standing there, staring at what is happening. Their eyes and mouths are wide open, their pupils constricted. The deputy can't believe his eyes. He is amazed that the Necromancer could single-handedly turn the tide of battle. An unperturbed red-haired monster stands looking out over the field where everything was happening. A small, winged creature sits on his shoulder. The Orc Lord, having lost faith in victory, utters words that he didn't expect mere corpses to be able to stop him. On the ground lies a creature with its limbs torn off, a horrified expression on its face, mouth open. The Orc Lord stands and looks at the monster with red hair and asks him about the fact that he doesn't think they're enough to overpower him, does he? The Necromancer watching the whole process says it was amazing and that he finally found a decent body. A hand tries to grasp a sword assembled from bones. The Necromancer continues to say that the one is worthy of being to become one of his comrades. You can see the anger and hatred in the Necromancer's eyes as he swings his sword. A Necromancer attacks an Orc Lord and a fierce battle ensues between them. The Necromancer possesses inhuman speed, a sharp sword in his hands. The Orc Lord begins to use his best skill, the aura skill. Behind him, his large aura appears, which repeats everything exactly after him. The aura he created around him clenches a fist that is several times larger than the Necromancer and tries to strike him. The Necromancer instantly tries to dodge this blow and begins to disintegrate. His arm begins to disintegrate into pieces. The Orc is at a loss as to what he is doing. His gaze was fierce, his teeth clenched, his face wrinkled. The Necromancer holds a sharp sword with a golden hilt. He tries to attack the Orc, but the Orc successfully defends himself. The Orc's face shows a gloating smile. There are massive explosions. Everything is blazing, everything is exploding. Everything is burning brightly. The Orc Lord has a huge axe in his hands and is chopping the bones of the dead with it. The Orc Lord grabs the skeleton of one of the monsters and chops it up with his axe. The Necromancer tries to stop him, but he is powerless in this situation. Flashes of light blinding the eyes. Everything crumbles and shatters. The Necromancer stands, and behind him is his army. Across from them stands an embittered orc. He has one hand clenched into a fist and is holding a weapon in the other. The Necromancer's feet began to consume the bones that form from beneath the ground. Everything beneath him burns with purple flames and tries to consume. The Necromancer's body is almost completely taken over by bones. Memories begin to flash in his mind, the faces of people dear to him. A dark-haired girl with big brown eyes stands and thinks about something. The girl with greenish hair squinted her eyes and immersed in her thoughts. You can see anger in the Necromancer's eyes. He is seriously puzzled about something. His face is still covered, his hair slightly down over his eyes. Two girls, one with dark hair and long, the other with short blonde, flashed in his mind. Friends of the young man who looks right at him flash his mind. A bearded, gray-haired man with a ponytail and muscular arms also arises in his mind. For the sake of those he cares for here in this world, he applies protection on himself to defeat the enemy. His body becomes completely covered in skeleton. A monster with a skull instead of a head and a beast of prey stand and watch as if mesmerized. The red-haired monster with red eyes, who has a small winged creature sitting on his shoulder, is also watching everything going on intently. The Necromancer was completely covered in bones. A bony armor has formed on him. It covered his chest, arms, and legs. A steel sword can be seen in his hands. The Orc Lord stares dumbfounded at the Necromancer. He was even more angry when he saw that the Necromancer was wearing armor that protected him. The Orc fiercely tells the Necromancer to face him in battle for the last time to continue living as Andreas Cromwell. The Necromancer starts swinging his sword with great speed. He is very determined with his hands clenched in tension. There is a violent fight between a Necromancer and an Orc Lord. Everything goes up in flames. Those watching are in complete shock. The red-haired monster stands with his teeth clenched. A small winged creature sits on his shoulder, also watching. The Necromancer's eyes are filled with rage and hatred. He has only one thing on his mind, that he wants to destroy the Orc Lord and defeat him. The Orc Lord applies his advantage skill. The Necromancer tries to dodge this blow. Everything around him shatters and cracks. A bird's eye view of a beautiful gray building with a blue roof. At the front entrance is a large plaza. This is the Rodlin Academy. An antique clock sits against the wall. This academy of the Empire is the most prestigious, where those recognized as promising come to study. Students are gathering in the hall. They are all those who are hiding their identities. They are wearing black cloaks with hoods. While the gathering is going on upstairs, a purple flash forms on the stairs downstairs in the basement. Andreas stands, cowering. You can see the fright in his eyes. Behind him, a blonde-haired man stands and calls his name. The man's name is Heron. The room looks like a morgue. There are tables everywhere with dead creatures lying on them. All the floors and walls in the room are stained with blood. Karen asks Andreas about where the body he worked with last week lies. He rebukes him for not being able to remember it. Two guys standing with their backs to each other. They're researchers of forbidden black magic, necromancers. If anyone finds out about this, Andreas will be executed on the spot. A red liquid that looks like blood pours from a large vessel with a narrow neck. Because of this, Andreas has to conduct his experiments in secret. He holds a vial from which a red liquid, similar to blood, pours out. There are signs depicted on the site. In the middle of the image lies a dead body. Heron and Andreas are preparing to perform some kind of magical ritual. Karen is holding a skull in one hand, and from his other hand, a blue light that looks like smoke begins to emit and spread everywhere. Andreas has his eyes wide open, watching it all. A strange blue mist spread across the room. The dead body that was just lying in the middle of the platform begins to rise. It is engulfed in blue light. Behind him, Andreas is watching. The revived corpse begins to decompose and screams loudly. It withers and squirms. Another magical practice has failed. Karen instructs him to clean this place up and go upstairs. The body that had been ritualized was just a skeleton. The room is shrouded in darkness. Only the dim light from the torch on the wall makes it possible to see anything in the darkness. The mop rag had completely absorbed the blood. It's now a crimson color. He's trying to clean up the blood with a mop. He reasoned that even though it was dangerous, he felt he was getting a lot out of it. There are mysterious books on the shelves. They look frightening. Some of them have skulls on them. Some have strange drawings. Taking the golden book, Andreas reasons that this is the only place where he can read decent books about black magic. He walks back up to the room where the blonde-haired man is and apologizes for being long. Sitting at a huge table is Karen. He asks Andreas about the fact that if he has half the day to clean, how is he going to do all the work himself? Karen looks at Andreas sternly. He talks about the fact that he trusted him with a simple job and he is so worked up. His face frowned. He says he won't tolerate another one of his failures. Andreas looks at him and says that he will do his best and will try his best. Rising from his chair, Heron tells him to go to Benhala's National Cemetery and bring him another body, and he gives him another chance. The second tier of the room is enclosed by a partition. Karen reminds Andreas that he accepted him into the academy despite the fact that he is an orphan. Heron, with a serious face, goes on to say that Andreas must constantly prove that he is worthy of life. Andreas realizes that he's just going to be another body for his experiments. He wouldn't like that very much. Walking over to the closet, the man finishes his speech and tells him not to let him down and tells him to leave. Andreas folds his arms guiltily. As he leaves the office, Andreas thinks about the fact that Karen didn't even cover his travel expenses. The students are crowded around the door, all looking at him. Andreas guesses why everyone is staring at him like that. He starts to get angry. The students look at him in amazement while marveling at how and why he is still here. Andreas angrily pushes everyone away and hurries to get away faster. He yells at them that this is not a show, and for them all to get out of his way. He is furious. The students look after him. Andreas Cronwall is a student in the magic department. He is in his junior year. He is not endowed with any talents. An old, shabby gray building comes into view. It is dreary and gloomy. Andreas is holding on tight to someone's leg and begging to be left at the academy. He's the academy's worst-ranked, third-rate villain. Andreas tearfully begs to be given a chance to continue his studies. But even though he doesn't want to, he has to continue living as Andreas. A disc with a game called The Great Sin. Makoto Kaneshiro, inside the world of the game, plays as a character named Andreas. A stone-faced Makoto Kaneshiro stands in the background of the city. He is a special forces officer who has been unable to adapt to normal life in society. This same man, but now all overgrown and having lost the meaning of life, believes that the only thing that keeps him going is the game The Great Sin. Makoto Kaneshiro sits behind his computer screen. He looks like a zombified man. He finally managed to get through this game in week 12. Suddenly the phone rings. He picks up the phone. Someone with detailed knowledge of his personal information and gambling habits is calling him. He is very surprised by this call. He quickly tries to immediately turn off the computer by pressing the button on the system unit. On the screen appears the caption, Game Character, Makoto Kaneshiro Andreas Cromwell. He became a playable character 6 months before the main story began. The character Andreas, played by Makoto Kaneshiro, opens his mouth and screams in terror. He is a character who is always followed by the shadow of death. The main characters of the game look intimidating and determined. Among them are 2 guys and 2 girls. They find out the real identity of Heron and kill him. A black creature in female form with blonde hair and bright eyes looks very scary. It forms golden stripes around itself. Andreas is in the large hands of Karen. He realizes that if he doesn't find a way to escape him, he won't be able to avoid becoming involved in the events. Andreas stands wide-eyed, a look of fright in his eyes. Behind him are some scary monsters. It's a sunny day. Classes are in progress at the academy. Some of the students are already going home. Some are just going to study. Andreas is sitting on a bench in the park, musing about something. He realizes that he has no choice but to become stronger before everything starts. He realizes that the only thing he can count on is the 2 special features he'll get when he plays for 13 weeks. Andreas gets up from the bench. One of those skills got the dual essence trait, which allows you to use both magic and ball possession. In Andreas's mind, an image of a beautiful golden sword arises that has a powerful force and can help him. He walks down a path in the park and reasons that he can't survive by focusing on just one of these skills. He needs to possess both. Looking at the hand on which the ring glistens, he realizes that he has no choice of the skill that will best enhance his necromancy. He clenches his fist with all his might and tries to calm himself down and set himself up for everything to be okay. An electronic scoreboard appears in front of Andreas's face with a selection of characteristics. He looks at the electronic scoreboard and realizes that this is the first time he's seeing this skill set and there's really an informed choice to be made here. Andreas learns each skill and tries to apply it on himself. He realizes that the way of weapons, the king of beasts, is definitely not suitable for him. He realizes that the choice needs to be approached thoroughly, and decides for himself that he will start by looking at skills he hasn't seen before. Then he notices one of the skills that catches his attention. He starts to wonder what it means. He whispers the word, evolution. It was the skill that most interested him. Evolution is the phenomenon of adaptation of a living being to reach higher places. A fish gradually evolves into a more evolved creature. Andreas, realizing that this is a trait he's never seen in a game before, suggests it's something he really needs right now. He realizes that this skill is exactly what he needs right now. He selects this skill with a confident movement of the finger of his left hand and presses the screen. Standing in front of the academy on the scoreboard in front of his face, the message, "The line has been chosen," pops up. There is no turning back. The electronic board in front of his face gradually dissolves and disappears. Andreas is dressed in a black robe, a long, sharp sword at his belt. His face became unrecognizable, his eyes filled with anger and turned red. Andreas finally sees what kind of future this trait will bring him. Pictures arise in his mind, images of terrifying monsters. A terrifying creature with the face of a bony ram instead of a face with flames coming out of its head. It has a hideous, scary look. On his head is a crown with ruby stones. After gaining the evolution skill in this world, he will definitely survive and pass this game as the character Andreas. Rodlin Academy provides free housing for its students in a dormitory called Maple Leaf. Andreas sits in his room on the edge of his bed. He's a very minor villain in this game, but in this reality he really was completely powerless. Andreas stands up in his bed, holding himself up so he doesn't fall over. He realizes that his only immediate asset is his necromancy. He thinks about going into the explorer's room in the dungeon before heading to the graveyard. From the back of the chair he takes his black cloak and rather hurries to depart, for he cannot waste time. It's a sunny day. Clouds are floating in the bright sky. There is not a single cloud. As he walks outside of the dorm, he stops and thinks about how he needs to get stronger as soon as possible. It's not just for the main event. An image of other creatures appears in his mind. He realizes that there are countless characters other than Karen in the game that could kill him. The entrance to the explorer's room in the dungeon is a huge, massive gate-like door. Andreas enters the explorer's room in the dungeon and walks over to a rack of books. He goes through the books and is horrified by their strange titles. Throwing a glance at the cage behind him, he realizes that there is something else in this room right now that could kill him just as quickly. An exhausted girl with red hair sits in a cage. She is almost completely naked. The girl doesn't even look in his direction. Her eyes are cast downward. Andreas suggests that she definitely looks a lot like a vampire. Andreas speculates that the vampires in this game are invulnerable to sunlight and are creatures capable of wielding powerful magic. Heron realizes with anger that this girl is not the type of creature he could get with ease. He picks up one of the books from the top shelf of the rack. He thinks about it being the equivalent of a boss in the middle of a game. Someone behind him calls out to him. He turns to the girl sitting behind the bars and looks her straight in the eye. She's trying to get up. Her eyes are red and she has a sly, intent look. She asks Andreas to help her get out of here. An old train rushes at high speed in total darkness, bright headlights illuminating its path. Andreas, wearing a hood over his head, sits in a train seat and muses that the vampiress's offer was very tempting. Smiling slightly, he suggests that perhaps it was a gift from above. He remembers the sly face of the vampire girl, what she tells him about how if he lets her out, she will kill Karen. Hearing this, Andreas fell silent. It was expected of the vampiress to see the truth through his concerns of Karen. The serious look on the red-haired girl's face suggested that she was eagerly waiting for him to respond to her proposal. Andreas suggests that there is no guarantee that she will let him go. The girl swears to him that she will not kill him. Her sly look gives away her nature. She is definitely lying. She repeats again that she is telling the truth and swears again. A look at her face convinces him that she is definitely lying to him. He says he will think about her proposal. Andreas looked at the canister of a liquid that looked very much like blood. At that moment, the girl shouts to him that there is no time to think about it. Back in reality from his memories, he rides on a train that takes him somewhere fast. He decides to try to learn more about vampires. Outside the train window, it is slowly getting darker. Bright stars appear in the sky. The wheels of the train begin to slow down with a rattle and soon come to a stop. Andreas arrived at the National Cemetery as Karen had told him to. Andreas is approaching the gate of the cemetery. He is breathing heavily. In his hand, he holds a huge wheeled suitcase, which he rolls behind him. Andreas concludes that he needs to invest in physical development first. He is very tired of dragging such a huge suitcase behind him. He approached the gates of the National Cemetery. This is where black magicians collect bodies for their needs. As he gets close to the gate, he informs someone standing inside the cemetery that he has come from Jenny's house, that he is her third grandson. A worker inside the cemetery outside the gate asks him if he has brought flowers. Andreas replies that he has brought 13 azure irises. The employee stands and waits for him to come in. Andreas realizes that he had a poor idea of the password. It's a good thing he wasn't confused. Walking deep into the cemetery, Andreas sees a man warming up after digging a grave. Behind him on the ground lies an excavated red coffin. Upon seeing Andreas, the man smiles at him and is happy that he has finally arrived. He says that Andreas has arrived on time. In a coffin lies the corpse of a man holding a large golden sword. The red-haired man presents him with the corpse of a knight. Pleased with what he sees, Andreas briefly thanks him. Andreas pulls the corpse out of the coffin and drags it behind him, while shouting that it is very heavy. He struggles to drag it on his back. Andreas packs the knight's corpse into his large suitcase. He realizes that he has to go now before it is too late. He was about to leave when he happened to glance at one of the graves and stopped. It was a huge and spectacular metal grave with a large cross. 3 burnt candles and a single withered bouquet of flowers are placed in front of it. Not believing his eyes, he feels that he has seen that name on a gravestone somewhere. He realizes that this is the grave of Swordmaster Nickel Lifehill. A huge waterfall whips by. The man who stands in front of the waterfall has spent decades in isolation, practicing following the path of the ball. A gray-haired man with a disheveled head of hair and a beard is very much puzzled about something. He is completely immersed in his thoughts. The man looks unkempt. His clothes are ragged. He's waving his sword. In this way, he is practicing and watching the sword's movement. Suddenly, he loses his strength and falls to the ground. He sees this branching tree in front of him. The sun's rays blind his eyes. This man dedicated decades of his life to the sword and became master of aura. The last thing he sees in front of him is falling leaves right on top of him in bright sunlight. At this point, he dies of old age. This fact is one of the Easter eggs in this game. The character Andreas never realized why the game makers added this post here. Andreas stands and looks at the man who provided him with the corpse. The man is burying the hole that was Master Aura's grave. Andreas introduces the Death Knight he created from the body of Master Aura. He will be on a large black horse that is completely covered in armor. He presents such a picture. The creature that Heron created simply disintegrates into bones. Heron realizes he can't create a high-ranking one. Andreas is standing. A suitcase with a corpse is standing next to him. He keeps thinking that after his evolution, the situation will take a different turn. He sighs deeply and looks down at his feet. He thinks to himself that he definitely needs a body with good, latent abilities. Andreas calls out to a man named Raymond. Before Andreas can even tell him what he wants, the man flatly refuses. Angry, the man drops the shovel, leaving the hole unburied. An enraged Raymond looks at Andreas and tells him to get Karen's permission first and that he should think about what position he is putting Raymond in. Confused, Andreas can't get anything out of himself and just mumbled something. Unable to think of anything better, he offers his gold ring in exchange for a new body. The dumbfounded man stands and stares at him. Raymond stares at the shimmering ring in disbelief. It's a ring engraved with the Count's coat of arms. If he sells it, he could make a fortune. Utterly desperate, Andreas explains to him that he has nothing but his old ring, and as a magician, results are more important to him than anything else. Andreas convinces Raymond to keep it from Karen. He puts the ring directly into his palm. He agrees to the deal. Andreas was very happy that the man finally agreed, despite the fact that it was the ring of a fallen noble house. It was impossible to resist. The full moon illuminates the entire cemetery. Andreas suggests he dig up the second corpse where the Master of Aura rests. Andres looks into the coffin and sees an elderly gray-haired man lying in it. As he closes the lid of the coffin, he thinks about his future that he saw yesterday and dreams that it will finally begin. Behind him, a bony monster emerges from the flames of the fire. He looks terribly frightening. He is holding a sharp sword, his eyes glowing red. Karen looks appraisingly at the body of the knight that Andreas has retrieved from the graveyard and says that it is a suitable body for their upcoming ritual. As he leaves, Heron tells Andreas that he will be responsible for the aftercare. Andreas carefully works the knight's naked body with a rag, washing it. At this point, he indignantly thinks to himself that he has only just returned, and Karen has already loaded him down with work. Carefully working his body with the rag, Andreas reassures himself that he works better when he's irritated. Maybe it's a bodily memory. A little tired, he touches his head with his hand and realizes he needs to get this over with quickly so he can start exercising sooner. Andreas starts mopping the floor. He gives the traces of blood from the pad a good scrubbing. Above him hangs the suspended body of a corpse. Andreas thinks about the fact that he has a second corpse hiding in his suitcase. It's the body of Master Aura Nickel. Having almost scrubbed the pad, he thinks about what's ahead of him. At this level he's at, a skeleton is the best he can work with. Andreas imagines standing next to the active skill selection table and choosing necromancy. He realizes he has no money, so he can't practice on another body yet. The clanking of the rings of the black metal chain can be heard. They're tight. Completely absorbed in his thoughts, he continues scrubbing the floors. He hears a voice calling him, asking how long he has to wait. Andreas realizes it's a vampire girl who is behind bars. Turning to face the grate, he stares at her. He has a mop in his hands. He asks her if she has slept. She looks disgusted and reminds him that she told him she wouldn't kill him. She urges him to let her out immediately. He takes confident steps in her direction, approaching the grate. As he gets close to the bars, he sees that the girl's hands are bounded by metal chains with shackles. She is down on her knees. She has a sly look on her face. Her eyes are bloodshot. She feels hopeful that he will help her escape. He recalls Karen's face and thinks about how he was even able to tie her up and lock her behind bars. He has a book in his right hand. He tells her that when he read this book, he found the answer to his question. The exasperated vampire girl asked him what was wrong and why he was standing silently staring at her. She got up from her knees and started to walk over to the grate, asking him why he was still hesitating. She began to move away from the bars while telling him to make a decision as soon as possible. Otherwise, she would probably kill him after all. Then she suddenly hears the phrase that he is ready to let her out. Her eyes filled with hope and faith. She was glad to be free at last. She turns around and looks at him. Andrea says he can't take it anymore and licks Heron. Overjoyed, the girl believed that everything would be as she had planned. She asks to be taken off her shackles sooner rather than later. But then she heard that she had to swear on her family's name. Her eyes look frightened. She doesn't know the right thing to do. Andreas talks about how she must swear on her family's name and promise that she won't kill him when he releases her. After his words, her hands shook and almost clenched into a fist. He realizes that, judging from her reaction, the contents of the book are true. He looks at her carefully and remembers that the book says that vampires, when they swear on the name of their family, cannot break the oath. His eyes rounded. He hadn't expected her to agree to this. Without a second thought, she says she swears on Lucifer's name. Andreas gets very close to the grid and wonders if it's really that simple. An electronic scoreboard suddenly appears in front of his face. Condition met. A specimen capable of evolution has been discovered. Angela Lucifer has a 55% chance of successful evolution. A vampire girl named Angela Lucifer looks at him in surprise, and she doesn't see the electronic scoreboard and doesn't understand where he's pointing his finger. Andreas is outraged that so easily her evolution rate has increased by such a large percentage. He is given the choice of triggering the evolution process. Andreas ponders, his hand held at his chin. He realizes that this is his chance to test the trait before using it on Nickel. He warns the girl that if something goes wrong, it will not be his fault. She doesn't understand what he means. Angrily, she realizes that he is just tricking her. Out of anger, she rocks. On the electronic scoreboard, Andrea presses the yes button. This means that he has decided to start the process of Angela Lucifer's evolution. Suddenly, the vampire girl's red eyes fill with hatred and rage. She becomes terrified and no longer resembles herself. She holds her head and moans loudly. Something inexplicable happens to her. Glowing multicolored rings form around her. Andreas watches in horror. She screams and moans. Drops of sweat come to her face. Tears are streaming from her eyes and drooling from her mouth, and the veins on her forehead are swollen. She looks awful, as if someone unknown has taken up residence in her. The girl is screaming and foam is coming out of her mouth. She is wriggling and squirming all over. Watching the goings-on behind bars, Andreas is dumbfounded, unable to understand what's going on here. After this attack, the girl just falls to the ground and stops moving. Andreas tries to call out to her and tells her to get up. The stone staircase that leads to the basement is illuminated by a dim light. Andreas learns something new about this feature of evolution. On the couch lies the body of Aura Master Nickel. Andreas carefully treats his body with a cloth. Laying his body on the ritual pad, he holds the bowl in his hands and thinks about how it would be okay if he summoned him right now. Andreas proceeds to perform the ritual. His face is determined. Some kind of black powder is visible in his hand. In his hands, a hovering rune forms from the powder and emits clots of blue light. He begins to summon the skeleton. Right now, a basic necromancy called skeleton summoning has been activated. One body detected. Andreas looks on, holding a glowing rune in his hands. His eyes are wide with amazement. He realizes that there is no turning back. He exerts a tremendous amount of effort, but for some reason his body does not rise. He does not immediately realize what is happening here and continues his ritual. He is amazed that it takes that much mana to just lift a single skeleton. The corpse's skin slowly begins to peel off the body, the bones begin to show. A small amount of time passes and only a skeleton remains of the body, leaving bare bones. The skeleton tries to get to his feet. A glowing ray of blue light burns around him. Andreas looks at everything that is happening with his mouth wide open. An electronic scoreboard appears, announcing that Andreas has successfully completed the skeleton summoning. His necromancy level is increased from 1 to 3. The skeleton tries to get to his feet. A glowing ray of blue light burns around him. Andreas looks at everything that is happening with his mouth wide open. The electronic scoreboard that appeared in front of Andreas reports that the corpse's level is transcendent. He could gain some self-awareness from his past. The skeleton is fully recovered. He stands confidently on the pad and is all crispy. It's like he's smiling. This skeleton is a warrior. He has special traits of self-awareness, and his main skill is the sword. Skeletal mastery is a state of being at the peak of the highest stage of professionalism. Andreas stares at the skeleton in amazement and questions him about whether he was really the master of Aura when he was alive. The skeleton begins to make some sort of incomprehensible gesture with the index fingers of one hand. Watching his finger, he asks him the question, does he assure himself to Andreas? The skeleton, with a confident look, makes the kind of gesture that means okay. It means that the skeleton trusts Andreas completely. Andreas smirks, a snide expression on his face. He's already imagining what's going to happen next. Andreas sits in his room on a chair with his feet up on the table, his face filled with humility and joy. He is anticipating further success. He's looking at some notes on his wall. It's a calendar. He realizes that there is still about a year left before Karen dies. Sitting at his desk, an electronic scoreboard appears in front of him. Studying it, he concludes that if he wants to survive, he has a lot to do. An inscription that characterized his main traits came out on the electronic scoreboard. Even if one didn't use summoning skills, their quality was still increasing. Andreas hears a rumble behind him in the room. He rises from his chair. He brings up an electronic scoreboard that gives him the choice of calling on one warrior skeleton. He chooses an option and presses the yes button. Just then, Nickel's skeleton emerges from the blue hallway. He tells him to come into the room. The skeleton's bones crunch. Andreas realizes that it will be bad if anyone sees him. He makes a decision to get dressed as soon as possible. The dormitory provided by Rodlin Academy is covered in sunlight. It's a beautiful summer day. Andreas dresses the skeleton in robes. He is wearing a long hooded cloak jacket, dark gloves, long boots, and a maroon scarf around his neck. After looking at what Nickel's skeleton looks like, he talks about how no matter how you look at it, it now looks like a human. The clothed skeleton begins to demonstrate his abilities. He holds a sword, he wields it skillfully. Andreas looks at him satisfactorily. He makes sure that what was written in the clues from the creators of the game is true. He really is a master of his craft. Even though he died while practicing, he still practiced despite being dead. It's amazing. On Andreas's face, a smile can be seen on his lips. He realizes that this plus for him anyway. Andreas clenches his fist. He realizes that he's finally found the ability to develop his not-so-good trait. Master Aura's skeleton is still practicing hard. Andreas calls out to him. Stopping his action, the skeleton looks at him questioningly. Andreas asks to be taught how to wield a sword the way he does. An information scroll for Andreas comes out on the electronic scoreboard. It says that in the world of great sin, talent and rank are important factors. The skeleton is trying to teach Andreas the proper moves. Andreas is holding a stick instead of a sword, just in case he gets hurt. As he makes the movements, as he swings his sword, drops of sweat come to Andreas's face. He feels as if his muscles are on fire. An image of the creatures arises in his mind. He feels envy, but is pleased that Nickel is teaching him how to achieve a body like those creatures. He imagines himself as a jock. If Nickel teaches him what he himself is perfectly capable of, he will be able to use that aura in the future. Andreas mentally imagines a blue light burning in his ribcage and a red light burning in his lower abdomen. He feels that he will be able to walk the path of a swordsman mage. He is well aware that development will be difficult for him, but if he can handle the initial phase, he will become stronger than anyone. Andreas is completely immersed in his fantasy. Suddenly, someone pinches his arm. Andreas smiles and chuckles. It was unexpected. It tickled him. He sees that it was the skeleton that pinched him. With a nonchalant look, the skeleton tells him to concentrate, and still makes the strange gesture of rotating the index finger of his left hand. Smiling slightly, Andreas asks him about how he can squeeze his hand so hard when he's just a pile of bones. Putting a hand on his shoulder and squeaking slightly, he explains to him that he was special forces when he was alive, that physical training is not a challenge for him. Nickel remembers himself as he was when he was alive. He was special forces. All the action takes place in the dormitory of Roland Academy in Andreas's room. Andreas is sitting at the table. Since he let Nickel out today and didn't go to class, how much his necromancy level has increased. Holding a mug in his hand, Andreas calls up the electronic scoreboard to familiarize himself with his information. Andreas clicks on the electronic scoreboard screen and sees that in about 5 hours his necromancy level has risen by 2 units. 200 hours are required to advance to the beginner level. After reaching the beginner stage, progress should become much slower. Suddenly he realizes that Karen hasn't summoned him to his side in quite some time. Andreas imagines in his head a vampire woman behind bars. He realizes that completing evolution takes a lot of time, so it's okay. Andreas focuses on the idea that completing evolution takes a large amount of time, so I guess it's okay. Suddenly, someone abruptly interrupts his train of thought. He turns around indignantly. It's the sound of swords swinging that keeps him from concentrating. In front of him stands the skeleton Nickel, who still continues to swing his sword. His training doesn't stop for a second. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, Andreas turns to the skeleton and says that he realizes that the skeleton is not tired since it is inanimate, and calls it something. He begins to fantasize that if he had potions, he could train and heal himself indefinitely. Healing potion heals internal injuries and removes fatigue. Generation potion heals external wounds and speeds up recovery. This is where he thinks about brewing them himself. He understands what ingredients are needed, but he doesn't know their specific ratios. Andreas gets up from the table, taking his robes from the back of the chair. He needs to attend a few classes and replenish his knowledge of potions. Andreas is determined to go to Roland's Academy. It's a majestic building with a dome. Opening the door, he stands on the threshold and looks to see that there aren't many people in class. The room is practically empty. Opening the door, he stands on the threshold and looks to see that there aren't many people in class. The room is practically empty. The two sitting at the desk are discussing why Andreas came to the potions class. They say that he wants to attract girls that way. The quiet hum of the students' discussion can be heard. They say that Andreas's family is already at the bottom anyway. Andreas tries to ignore them. He realizes it's easier for him to keep quiet. He's not here to attract attention. His expression becomes angry. He is very unhappy that everyone thinks of him that way. He's going to show everyone what he can do. As Andreas walks up the steps to his seat, a blonde-haired girl from another row watches him. The girl sighs heavily as she looks at Andreas, emitting a stream of air from her mouth. Outside the lecture hall door, the instructor can be heard loudly asking the students for silence to form. From a bird's eye view, the academy looks majestic and very beautiful. A medical herbalism class is in progress. Andreas concludes that what is happening so far is not too different from what happened in the game. Tired of listening to what the professor is telling him, Andreas wishes he would hurry up and get to the mixing proportions. The professor says the next thing they'll talk about will be a method for creating physical enhancement potions. Running a pointer across the board, the professor reminds us that this potion is based on mochaima leaves and 3 other ingredients. He's angry over the fact that even though this is an intermediate-level course, the professor is teaching them a potion that has so many side effects. Andreas rises and raises his hand, asking the professor to ask a question. He allows him to do so. Andreas asks him why he doesn't add hanpi's extract and matarata root. The professor looks at him dumbfounded through his glasses. The blonde-haired girl sitting at the desk a little farther away from him looks at Andreas in surprise and can't believe her ears. Andreas leans confidently on his desk. Everyone stares at him in surprise, not hiding their irritation. But Andreas is sure he's not wrong. He tells Andreas that if he wants to put them in there, he can just boil the soup. This is when all the students start laughing out loud. But Andreas knows for a fact that everything he just listed are the ingredients needed to create a physical enhancement potion. Andreas suggests that perhaps this recipe hasn't been discovered yet. The students behind his back chuckle gloatingly at him. The bell rings to announce the end of the class. Everyone gets up from their seats. Andreas realizes that his knowledge was better than what he had just learned. Andreas thinks about the fact that maybe he'd be better off practicing on his own after all. He realized from the beginning that it was a fool's errand to expect anything. He hangs his bag on his shoulder and walks away from the study hall. A blonde girl follows him. She stares after him, wanting something but afraid to call out to him. She's thinking about something, her narrowed lips pressed together. The large corridor of the research department at the academy comes into view. The corridor is very gloomy. Only the dim light of a lantern illuminates it. Andreas sits down and decides to create a potion on his own. There are many chemical vials and substances on the table where he is working. After mixing a few ingredients, an electronic board forms in front of his face, saying that the creation of the potion failed. What a shame. This girl who was standing behind him in the hallway is one of the playable characters who is a genius in potions. This character's name is Lucia Everlast. She looks very nice. She shouldn't be close to Andreas. So why is she here? The girl enters the room where Andreas is trying to brew a potion. She tells him that he has failed many times. Andreas pays no attention to her. Lucia asks him with interest what he is experimenting on. She peers into his face. He, without opening his eyes, answers her that it is a secret. Without turning his face, he continues to tell her that he went to class and didn't take away any knowledge, but the number of his problems were increasing. Andreas is writing something down in his notebook. The girl looks at him and remains silent. The room is dead silent and tense. Slightly offended and folding her arms across her chest, the girl tells him that he is truthfully embittered. Andreas is already tired of her presence. Andreas turns slightly in her direction. Lucius tells him that she didn't think he was the kind of person who would be the first to suggest something. Here she angrily and suddenly slams her slender palm on the table. She walks close to the table and asks him if he would like to do research together. Lucia enigmatically looks right into his eyes while she asks him a question about isn't that a great idea? Andreas realizes that there is no need for him to refuse, but continues to further pad his price. Making a nonchalant expression on his face, he looks at her and asks her what she wants from him. The girl sadly asks him about the fact that is it weird that she wants a research partner? Andreas indifferently replies that it won't do her any good. Smiling sincerely, Lucia replies to him that it will be enough for her to receive his thanks. She suggests that he has talent and could create astounding things, and she aspires to a medicine that does not yet exist in this world. He stares at her mesmerized and thinks to himself that he just wanted to brew a potion for himself. A pale Lucia lies in bed. A woman sits on her knees. Next to her stands Karen. If she doesn't find a cure for her illness, she will one day die because of it. In the research room, she's trying to create a substance for herself that can cure her. Even the most famous doctors can't help her. Lucia is sitting at her desk, gloves on her hands and a test tube in her hand. This disease is very serious and was given to her by the system itself. She realizes that only someone like her can help her find a cure. She doesn't know the exact ratio of ingredients to create the cure. She creates potions to kill creatures. She's a true master potion maker, and for her to meet someone as clever as she is a great stroke of luck. Andrea sits at the table, still waiting for her to finally go and leave her alone. The girl does not give up and stares intently into his eyes. Andreas is trying to keep himself safe. He realizes that if he carelessly allows himself to become entangled with her, his life will only become shorter. The girl doesn't know what to get him interested in, so that he finally agrees and gives out the phrase peony mushroom. Andreas lowered his head, trying to hide his surprise. He realized at once what she meant. She tells him that they are also required to create the potion. She knows the basic ingredients that no one but him was supposed to know. Lucius points to the vial in which the potion is brewing. She asks him if he couldn't make this potion by adding peony mushroom to it. The atmosphere in the office is tense. Lucy says that she intuitively knows about it, and if he wants, she can help him earn money. A confused Andreas replies to her that she only says that because she's rich, and once she assures what she came for, she'll have to leave. Lucia heads for the exit. She opens the door and says one last thing to Andreas, giving him time to think about her proposal. The office door closes. Andreas is sure he doesn't need to think about it. He's already made up his mind. He is holding a stick and practicing swinging his sword. He has nothing to worry about if he accepts the girl's proposal, but there is a very big risk. Andreas diligently tries to repeat the motions after Nickel, but at this point, his head is filled with the fact that he can pick his own proportions for the potion. He makes a move and takes a swing. He figured he'd have to get some money from somewhere first. He makes a decisive swing of his sword. He has a puzzled look on his face. He wonders if he has any good ideas about how to make a lot of money quickly. Andreas believes that he will definitely succeed and become as powerful a swordmaster as his teacher Nickel. He looks fearfully at Nickel and tells him that he does know when. The latter is distracted. Andreas tries to focus on the training session, putting aside thoughts of money. He decides that afterwards he will have more time to think about it. While practicing, Andreas notices a table of test tubes with a letter on it. This might be a good idea. He reasons that his only idea is to ask for money from his sister, who has sent him a letter saying she misses him very much. He feels worthless. He realizes that this is the only way he has ever made money without much effort. Andreas is walking through the park. He realizes that no matter how helpless he is, this is not the way out. And he swears to himself that this is definitely the last time. From the balcony, a black-haired girl watches him with interest. She stares after him wide-eyed. She can't believe it's Andreas Cromwell coming. Andreas walks with a confident look. He is completely focused on his goal. In his hands, he holds a magic book. The black-haired girl watching him thinks to herself that even if he has changed, there is no way to change his horrible personality. She is sitting by the fountain with a book in her hands. There are students walking around, all busy with their work. Andreas walks among them. The black-haired girl's name is Diane Alwyn. She is the perfect Magus. This young lady is from the Alwyn family. In Andreas's mind, memories arise of how well they got along when they were kids. But because of the Cromwell family's debts, they stopped communicating. Andreas is starting to feel sad about his memories. He's done enough bad things since then. A cat-like girl with bright yellow glass eyes and long fangs tries to grab him with her paw. The cat-like girl grabs him with her clawed paws. He has a resigned look on his face. Thinking about the black-haired girl, he realizes that there is no point in even approaching her. He decides to ask his younger sister for money. A shining building graces the square. This city is the capital of Rodlin. 3 full moons brightly illuminate the entire space, making everything look magical. Andreas pulls the hood of his cloak over his head and searches for the place he wants and realizes it must be here somewhere. He's getting close. He sees a very beautiful restaurant with golden facades that is very respectable looking. He walks into a restaurant. It is full of men in suits and dressed-up women. Andreas notices his sister at one of the tables. His sister talks about how she has sent so many letters, but he hasn't answered any of them. They sit across from each other. The girl looks at her brother with love and respect. She says it is not like him to say such words. Her name is Emmy Cromwell. Andreas makes a pitiful appearance, looking down. In his hands is his mug. His sister is worried about him. Covering her mouth slightly with her lips to hide her smile, she questions the serious look on his face. She guesses that he needs money again. Without waiting for an answer, she hands him an envelope with the money she had prepared in advance. At the same time, she tells him not to spend it thoughtlessly. Andreas accepts the envelope and thanks his sister for everything. He promises to be sure to return them to Emmy. Looking at her brother's hand, the girl's eyes go wide with amazement. She asks him about his engraved ring. Andreas was startled and couldn't think of anything better to say than that he'd taken it off so he wouldn't lose it. The girl hopes he cares about the ring and has definitely put it away so he doesn't lose it. Andreas realizes that he can't tell her the truth so as not to upset her, but she has a frightened expression that gives him away. The girl talks desperately about how whatever happened he shouldn't have. Emmy doesn't have time to finish the sentence before Andreas lowers his head and starts apologizing to her. Emmy jumps up indignantly. A chair falls from under her with a clatter. She exclaims to him to get out, that she doesn't want to see him anymore. The girl shouts indignantly to her brother not to come here anymore and that he doesn't owe her anything. Andreas tries to stop her. He shouts after her that he will bring him back. His eyes are filled with despair and drops of sweat come to his face. His mouth is wide open. Andreas looks at the slammed door. This is the first time he's seen Emmy in this state. His engraved ring was very important to her. Tears come to his eyes and cover his eyes. He cannot hold back the tears, his lips trembling. He doesn't realize what this terrible feeling is that has taken hold of him. It's the first time he's experienced it. Andreas is annoyed. He promises himself that he will be sure to return the ring as soon as possible. Nickel, in his SWAT uniform, stands at the grave and salutes. He thinks about what's the point of life if you just exist. Nickel, already retired from Special Forces, scraggly and bearded, realizes that he wasn't happy when he was surviving on his own. Andreas takes a serious look. He realizes that he has to deal with what he has. He decides for himself that he accepts Lucia's proposal. It's dawning over the academy. Everything is lit with a beautiful, warm light. Someone's voice telling them to get up and run around a bit. Andreas is engaged in jogging. Lucia is lying on a bench doing nothing. As he runs past her, she shouts to him that he will succeed, even though he is a dumbass. They're hard at work practicing potions. They're trying to get what they want, but so far nothing's been successful. Andreas has taken a thorough look at his physical shape. His body is gradually gaining relief. At this moment, Lucia is just sleeping on the bench. They are carefully trying to brew the potion they need. They have concentrated expressions on their faces. They spend all their free time practicing and experimenting. Lucia lies on the couch all the time because of her illness. Andreas feels that sometimes she changes and helps to make things faster. Andreas is working on the potion while Lucia continues to sleep. He asks her why he feels like he's the only one trying. Andreas feels like she's pissing him off. He is holding a flask with a green chemical substance in it. Lucia sits behind him, covered with a plaid. She advises him to reduce the amount of matarata and increase the amount of Todoros extract. He accepts to do as she advises him. He does as Lucius told him to do. He knows that her intuition is very accurate, and sometimes it gets right to the root of the problem. Andreas is meticulously grinding the grass. He does it all for the money. He realizes that working together with Lucia is really better. From a narrow test tube, he adds some red substance to a large test tube, which begins to gurgle. Not to be mistaken, Andreas takes a pipette and draws the resulting substance into it. To make sure everything is extremely precise, Andreas uses a pipette to add it drop by drop into a narrow-necked flask. The red droplets sink into the violet substance and mix with it to form a homogeneous liquid. Suddenly, an electronic scoreboard appears in front of him, saying that he has produced a medium-level enhancement potion. Andreas jumps up from his chair with joy. He is insanely happy that they have succeeded. Frightened, Lucia asks him what happened. Andreas turns around to the girl. A happy expression can be seen on his face. He smiles slightly and shouts that they finally got it working. On the electronic scoreboard, it pops up that his potions talent, which has a temporary enhancement, has been obtained. All conditions have been met. Andreas looks at the scoreboard in surprise. He is surprised that he has received a new talent that he has the ability to develop to 33%. Condition met. A specimen capable of evolution has been discovered. Angela Lucifer has a 55% chance of successful evolution. His face expresses utter despair. He realizes that 32% is even lower than when he triggered the vampiress's evolution. The electronic scoreboard disappears in front of Andreas. He realizes that it is better to leave it for now and refuses to use the option offered to him. A delighted Lucia says that the potion they brewed can be drunk every day and that it has virtually no side effects. Agreeing with her, Andreas tells her to do it, since practically all the work before was done by him.